Welcome to the first of our Madrid Training Academy series. I'm Lucia, and I am the CA of Eudc, but also I'm going to be doing a workshop on constructive material and analysis. So I will start that right about now. So yeah, I think we've probably given enough time for people to join, so we'll just start the workshop right away. Cool. So what I'm going to be talking about in this workshop, I think that top speakers and the way that we think about them is sometimes a bit flawed, in that I don't think that top speakers necessarily are smarter people or have better ideas or just have so many thoughts in their head during prep time. Usually, when you watch a debate that's very, very high level, they aren't discussing things that you might not have thought about in prep time. Even if you look at World's Finals, the ideas that are out there in the debate, I don't think are incredibly complex or super difficult or thoughts that basically no one could have come up with except them. They just have different techniques in order to flesh those ideas out, which means that even if it's the same idea, it's more explained and slightly more developed. Those aren't techniques that are unapproachable to the average viewer, but rather it is very much something that you can train yourself to learn how to do. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today, on methodologies, strategies, and techniques that you can utilize to force you to flesh out your analysis. So the sort of example that I have, because I don't really watch that many debate speeches online, regrettably, is the World's Final from ages ago that this house would show the full horrors of war. And if you think about that final, in case that you have seen it, if you haven't, it's very good. Most of the ideas that are out there in regards to why we should show them are things around, oh, it deters war because individuals now can see what happens to soldiers that go abroad. It stops war crimes because we're more likely to hold accountable individuals when we see the atrocities that they have committed abroad. There's an increased incentive for there to be more transparency. Without it, it's easier for governments to lie about what they're doing over there, to call it torture rather than, to call it enhanced interrogation rather than torture. And again, those are, I think, ideas that all of us could have come up with. It's just that they're slightly more fleshed out, and that's why, you know, they get to World's Final. This workshop is also dealing with how to address the classic sort of it needed to have better analysis feedback that is very common, and I think probably the most common piece of feedback most speakers receive, but also the most frustrating one to get because it's very difficult to apply different types of analysis, or rather to apply different types of analysis to different debates. So it doesn't feel like a very, you know, a piece of feedback that you can necessarily learn from or immediately apply to the next debate, because obviously every debate is different. I think also things that you learn in this workshop should be very applicable to being open in government, because the best way to be better at open in government is to just get better at making arguments. The last thing that I'm going to add in terms of the introduction is, again, that I think that these structures are going to ideally help you by forcing you to analyze your arguments more. So even if it's a bit artificial or it feels a bit weird to be forcing yourself to think in this way at the start, I think that eventually once you do it for like a few debates, it becomes more second nature, and then that's just the way that you argue. I think really, really good first speakers usually have a set style or set structure that they already follow, which is why they can stand up after just 15 minutes and fully and very confidently deliver quite a, you know, comprehensive, holistic argumentation. That is because they already have that sort of technique and way of thinking about arguments that comes more second nature, even if they don't have actually that much written down. Even if this feels kind of like a basic workshop, I really don't think that it is, because I think that nailing the basics matters. If you think about individuals who are at the top of speaker tabs, they aren't there because they get 85s every round, but rather they are there because they're able to consistently score within the 80 to 82 bracket for even the lowest scores. And the way that you get that, like get an 80 even though you forfeit, or get an 82 even though you forfeit, I think is by making sure that your argumentation is still very good, even if you lost the debate, and that therefore you score within that bracket still. Cool. So moving on to things that we're going to be talking about is just, I'm going to quickly go over a review of structure, since that was part of the questions that we got asked via our form, then move on to different things that I think you can do to improve your analysis meaningfully. And then moving on to sort of, once you have your analysis, or rather before you even get to your analysis, how is it that you come up with your constructive material? Lastly, I'm going to briefly be talking about notes, even though I do think that that's like limited in how helpful it is, because obviously I take notes a certain way, other people might take them differently. We're also going to be discussing note taking and how different people do it in the panel discussion we'll have later today. Cool. So first things first, structure. So structure is kind of a big deal, and I think that anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. Obviously, BP debating is all about your content, and even if it's messy, but if your content is good, then that's good, and you should maybe still win. But the big problem is that if you don't have structure, no one has any idea what you're saying, and it becomes incredibly difficult and challenging to follow you. Sure, it is the job of judges, but you should and you could try and make it easier for all judges. The second thing that I want to highlight in terms of the structure thing that I didn't write down, but I do think it's also important, is that very frequently lack of structure doesn't just mean that judges have a harder time understanding you. It also means that overall you have a harder time actually making the arguments. It means that you end up repeating yourself more. It means that you get lost in thought, and it means that you end up going down like a spiral of doom in terms of talking about something that is actually not that relevant, and you don't really know how to make yourself stop. So really quickly, in terms of what I think the ideal PM structure kind of looks like, usually you'd have a 30-second max introduction because you don't want to waste more time. Then after that, you go into a roadmap of what you're going to be talking about. So just a description of the names of your arguments. And then after that, do your debate setup, move on to the first argument, second argument, and then conclude. The most important thing that I think happens in prime ministers is that you need to be super clear in transitions and when you're moving between arguments. I think a very easy thing to do is to just forget it and just kind of go through them without highlighting when you're moving through. It is difficult to follow. Please transition. But I think that what this workshop is dealing with is not just the basic prime minister structure that I just kind of added there as a reminder, but rather about structures within the arguments. And I think that that's slightly more challenging. Because when we start debating, we get taught kind of this structure that I think is like not great. Peel, you're better than this. Peel goes point, evidence, explanation, link. And you know, it's fine for novices that come from middle school, but you are definitely better than this. The problem that I have with Peel and the sort of the beef that I have with it is that I think that evidence and explanation can mean so many different things. So just telling someone that they should explain something doesn't really meaningfully change how they would structure an argument or how they would think about an argument. Equally, separating evidence and explanation is kind of weird to me because oftentimes they're just very intertwined. Obviously, there's some good things that you can take from Peel. It's good that you state your point, and it's good that you link back to the motion. So within the argument, I tend to think about sort of slightly more complex things. There isn't really sort of a set structure for making arguments that are more advanced than Peel, because they're very much up to you and how you like to structure things. So these are just things that I actually do in order to make my arguments seem more structured and clearer and easier to follow. I still have a title of my argument and I still have a thesis. The sort of what is the overall point that I am trying to show with this argument? What is it that I'm trying to prove? Then after that, you go to sort of the meat or the middle of the argument where you try to explain why your argument's true. So things that I do that I think are useful, I think you usually would have either a bunch of reasons here and explicitly say that. The sort of, look, I have 3 reasons why I think this thesis is true, and go through them. Or I have 2 main mechanisms by which I think this happens, and also go through them. Or other common structures like, first, we're going to explain what we think the status quo looks like. Now that we've explained it, we're going to move on to highlighting the problems there and how is it that our solution changes them if you're going for something like that. The important thing is that you're very clear as well when you move between them, because otherwise it can seem very stream of thoughty and the judge is like, you're talking about democracy now, but I think that you started with like individual change and the changes that individuals can make onto your lives. So we're not super clear how we got there. The other thing is, and I think this is a sort of important thing, and we're going to be talking more about explanations and evidence later, but I do think that it's quite important to remember that, you know, you don't have to have like an example for everything. But if you do, it also doesn't have to have like its own separate thing. It's very often intertwined. For example, when you give your 3 reasons, very often you'll have like one kind of example or like real life fact from my childhood intertwined within each of them. Sometimes when you go through a mechanism, like I'm gonna explain why this works via incentivizing people to vote, which means that, you know, more people vote, more represented democracy, yay. That's like a mechanism in and of itself. You probably don't need to go like it happens in democracies, as an example. Overall, there's just many ways to do it. I think the main thing is just to make sure that you still have the title and thesis of the argument, then like the meat of your argument, and you're clear in how you're going through it. And lastly, this bit. I think that once you finish the meat of your argument, then there's two main things that I think everyone should sort of focus on. Firstly, is why is your argument important? So that's just your impact, right? And I think that the vast majority of debaters are pretty good at this. I think that the vast majority of debaters are really bad at the second one, which is once you have explained that, I think you want to explain why is your argument more important than other arguments. This is also frequently known as weighing, and it is something that most debaters are really terrible at. So that's something that you should be better at. We're gonna go into more about how this happens, but I just wanna how you can do this rather. But I just wanna highlight that this is something that should be embedded within your argument structure. So this is something that when you write out your argument, you should always force yourself to have. So in terms then of my tips for argument structure is just be super clear in terms of the meat of the argument, but all arguments are just basically thesis, then reasons why your argument is true. And I think that the main thing is just structure them in a clear way. And lastly, why is it important and why is it more important than other points in the debate? We'll go through how to do this in a bit. So we're not gonna watch this because I don't wanna give Papa John more views than he already has, but as annoying as he is as a person, he is actually a very good first speaker. So if you look at this, which is an HWS round robin video, you can see that he basically follows the same argumentative structure that I kind of like highlighted above. So when he does his PM, he has an introduction, he does his setup. Then after that, when he goes through his arguments, he has a thesis statement, and then he has an explanation, and he does this explanation in the form of reasons. 3 reasons why my argument is true. 1, deterrence. 2, predictable outcomes. 3, people trust police more now. So this is for the motion. This house supports eye in the sky policing in urban areas with high crime rates. And then he moves on to his second argument after a clear transition. And the way that he does this is just like, look, right now, police are very harmful to these communities for 3 reasons why. So he's like, here are the problems that happen in the status quo. And then he identifies what changes. So now that happens less, and an explanation of what that's better. And then again, now we can do better things. So if you think about it, what he's basically doing is just following kind of the same argumentative structure that I mentioned earlier, in terms of like, you can give different mechanisms, you can give different reasons, or you can be like, problems with the status quo, here's how we fix them, here's how our solution is better. He's just basically doing that. And the main thing that I want to take away from this isn't like, wow, what an incredible speech, it's so good, even though like it is probably quite a good speech. The main thing that I want to take away from this is when you look at top speakers, and I think this is the most useful thing that you can get out of watching speeches online, isn't to try and replicate Cheng Wu's argument and be like, aha, I could definitely use this in all debates, because you won't be able to, and you'll sound worse than him. It is rather that the thing that you can get from looking at top speakers is understanding how they structure their arguments, and trying to replicate that, because that sort of shell is what will force you to have better analysis. But it's better because it's your own, which means that you'll be able to give it in a much more convincing way than they would be able to. Cool. So moving on to like, actually, how do you improve your analysis? So starting with the first one, in terms of giving, also, if anyone has any questions, feel free to like throw them in the chat. We'll also have some time for questions after. Yeah, there we go. After. So yeah, in terms of mechanisms or reasons, but what I mean by this is sort of like, how does something happen? How do you get to a particular impact? Or why is it that the thesis statement that you have in your argument is true? I think that the main thing that I would say in terms of improving is you want to try and have multiple, for every impact that you have, you want to either try and have multiple mechanisms, so ways in which your impact happens, and explain each of those, or you want to alternatively have multiple reasons as to why your particular argument is true. If you look at the previous examples, he has at least 3 for every argument. And obviously you can just kind of like go through them as a stream of thought thing, but that's more confusing for you, for the judges, and for your partner, who then has to be like, wait, which ones did they not respond to? So try and list them. I do think that it makes you sound better. And the thing that I would recommend here when you're just sort of starting out is to always force yourself to have at least two. When I was starting out in terms of trying to force myself to have, so basically at some point in my career, I was like, I think I'm good at recognizing what the strategic goal is. I think I am quite bad at actually executing that and explaining my analysis. So one of the things that I would try to do is every time that I give an argument or a counter argument, I will always be like, I have to say two things about this. I have to give two reasons, or I have to give two mechanisms by which this happens. And gradually it just kind of like became more second nature. So I think this is something that you should try and do, to force yourself to give at least two. One of the questions that we also got asked was, how do you know when to stop in your explanation? Because obviously you have to explain your reason and you have to explain your mechanism, but like, where do you stop, basically? I think that you want to stop at the point in which you don't think that it is, that it's something that, you know, if you try to tell an average person on the street, they would be like, wait, I don't understand. An average smart person, right? Someone who's like into politics, the average informed voter, if you will. But basically, I think that if you go the way that, if in a motion about, say that that's in, in a motion that where you say, for example, well, we think that this thing that we're doing is good, because overall it will incentivize politicians to campaign in areas that are previously disenfranchised, which means that those individuals will vote more. And once they vote more, then overall they will hold politicians more accountable. So if they're terrible to them, then they'll be voted out of office. I think that that's a better explanation than I've heard in many debates in respect to how it is that democracy's check and balances cycles go. Because very frequently people just forget to explain that they do have to explain how it is that votes do hold politicians into account, and that there are incentives set in place in the systems of democracy to make sure that individuals, if they are bad at their jobs, get voted out. Or that parties, if they don't deliver on what they're promised, are also voted out. So basically, I think that you want to try and always be like, okay, if I explain this to the average informed voter, at what point would they ask for more information, or is it clear that my point is? If you're honestly like super bad at this and you're like, I find this incredibly intuitive anyway, at least try to give like a couple of sentences minimum of explanation for each of your reasons or for each of your mechanisms as like a rule of thumb. Cool. So I think that the easiest way to sort of go through it is an example. I have like one thing that you can try at home later. But for example, this house believes that feminist movements in deeply religious societies should integrate religious messages and institutions into their advocacy rather than distancing themselves from them. So let's say that you're prime minister and you have three different arguments. One is that you can achieve better social change. Second, that you can get better individual change. And third is that it is harder otherwise for the feminist movement to succeed. So in terms of the first one, in terms of social change, let's say that you have two mechanisms via which this happens. So the first one is that overall, as a feminist movement, you're better able to do things like campaign and obtain donations and money. The reason for that is that now individuals that are religious don't see you as terrible and anti-ethical to what they see as a moral imperative, which means that they're more willing to, for example, donate or go out and campaign with you, because very frequently people do want sort of women to be better off. They just don't want it at the cost of something that they see as more important than anything, so their religion. So overall, you're more likely to do things like get donations, and that's incredibly important because a lot of the ways in which feminist movements achieve change is via, for example, lobbying politicians, but also smaller waves of change via, for instance, providing contraception or family planning advice to women, or via helping victims of domestic abuse or providing shelter for women that are survivors of sexual assault. And those are all things that you require money from, and you can get more of that once you have this. The second way via which this changes, or the second mechanism, is via, the capacity to vote more pro-feminism politicians into power, which in the status quo, again, doesn't happen because individuals feel like if they vote for a pro-feminist politician, they're voting against the religious interest. And candidates that are religious also don't feel like they can put forward policies that are good for feminism because they are afraid that then they will lose their religious voter base. So when they're when they are clashing with each other, it means that, again, religious politicians don't put forward those policies, but also it means that people won't vote for you. So it's harder to get that policy passed. That happens considerably less. And that means that overall it's easier to pass that policy. So I think that overall, in that sort of argument, you are explaining basically two mechanisms, like get more money and also more likely to get a policy passed or politicians that are pro-feminist into power. And I think that it's sort of like the exact same thing, right? I just have two mechanisms and then I explain them. In the individual change, equally, you can be like, okay, there's two mechanisms for this. And I think that in this one, I would struggle a bit because I'd be like, wait, how are there two mechanisms for individual change? But eventually, if you force yourself to do it, I think you do like manage to find them. Do try and make them distinct, because debaters love to do that thing of like, I have 5 reasons why I actually only have 2. So don't lie, 2 is a perfectly good number. But for example, in individual change, you can say sort of, again, 2 things. One, overall, there's quite a lot of young women that probably come from very religious families within the society that just feel like they can't be into feminism because it is something that their family highly discourages. So it is much more likely that individual women are going to get more into it if it is something that their family doesn't see as the absolute root of all evil and completely against their moral background, but also something that you see other religious women that are like you and that come from backgrounds like you also engaging in. So it means that you're much more likely to get those women into feminism. And that's more important because those are likely the women that are going to be less familiar with those things, and therefore it's more important to convince them. I think that then obviously you can talk about how, like, well, this is important because social change doesn't move always in a completely radical manner, but very often it is about small milestones and slowly and organically changing the view of society, and this is a way by which you can achieve that. Then I guess that secondly, you can also say that overall it also means that your religious family, or that religious families, are also way less likely to be completely opposed to feminist goals. There is quite a lot of examples or situations of individuals being quite okay with, for example, the emancipation of women, because it also means that the family earns more money. It is just that if it becomes a moral imperative, they're much more likely to be against it than if it isn't. So I think that, again, it's sort of like coming up with 2 mechanisms. And then and why is it harder to succeed? I think you can just be like, look, going up against a religious establishment can be incredibly difficult because they hold a lot of power, which means that they can levy that power against you. 3 reasons why they are very powerful, and then 3 reasons why they also have an incentive to crush you as a movement. So I think that for these 2, it's all about coming up with mechanisms. Why does this happen? But this one is about coming up with reasons. Why is it harder to succeed? Because they're religious groups and religion overall are very powerful in these societies, bunch of reasons why. And second, it's also because then they have an incentive to sort of stop you on your tracks. So again, bunch of reasons why. But yeah, if you notice about this, it's basically kind of like the same thing. I just come up with reasons. But I think that the important thing is that during prep time, you try and force yourself to have at least 2. And that's sort of like where it comes from. Another thing, very frequently, when I pair up with whoever, very frequently that's a thing that you would do during prep time, that whoever is a first speaker can also ask you for help, can just be like, okay, can you give me like as many reasons as you have for this, why this is particularly true, or like, can you come up with any other mechanisms by which this happens, and you can come up with stuff together. But yeah, that's the main thing that I would recommend in terms of analysis. The second thing, comparatives, which is a thing that debaters are in theory very good at because it is the core of BP debating, but it's also a thing that debaters are actually really bad at. So that's why the wow Pikachu meme is there. People are quite bad at identifying the comparative. They're also quite bad at explaining why the comparative is there, or even explaining that a comparative exists. And they're also quite bad at, if they have identified the comparative, they're also quite bad at being like, basically at doing comparative analysis, at explaining why the comparative is worse than or better than their world. So this is just kind of like a bunch of things that I think are useful to think about and consider. The main thing is, I think that when you're in prep time, you always want to try and identify what both worlds look like. It is super important to discuss. It is incredibly frustrating to walk into a room where the only thing that you hear about is one side of the debate and not the other, because then it's like, okay, who wins? No one really proved anything because this is all a comparative exercise. But for example, in a motion like this house prefers a world where karmic reincarnation exists, you could talk about like what the current world looks like, but you probably also want to discuss what karmic reincarnation exists, what the world where karmic reincarnation exists looks like. Obviously, you want to do that if you're opening government, because you kind of like have to talk about it in your setup. But I think that irrespective of where you are in the debate, you also have to consider that in prep time and talk about it very explicitly. So, for example, if you were in prep time in this particular motion, I think that you probably want to be like, okay, what is karmic reincarnation? Okay, how does that change anything in the world? So does it change religion? Does it change the way that people view the way that they act? So like how they deal, does it change the way that they deal with death and grief and loss? So ask yourself sort of questions are regarding how it is that in the current world we see sort of death, I guess, and also how our actions affect what happens after death. And then ask ourselves sort of whether that changes and how that changes. So in that regard, there probably is some level of change of the religion that I haven't thought about very deeply in this sort of 30 seconds. I would say that in this one, or at least if I were discussing with a partner, I'd probably just be like, yeah, I think that it does change the incentive of individual interactions, because instead of going to heaven, you're still gonna be on earth. So it's probably a way to think of the earth as nicer rather than the transition of suffering before you go to heaven. So it probably means that you take care of earth more because environmentalism, but it probably also means that then you stop being so complacent or stop being complacent about things that happen in your daily life because, oh, it's okay, I'm gonna go to heaven because after all, this could be the best that you get out of reincarnation or something. And I forgot what the last one was, but basically I think that it's important to sort of try and think, what are the things that this motion is changing about the world? Like, what does the current version of the world look like? And what does it affect? So in this case, if you're talking about the afterlife, basically, what are things that affect our behavior? And then how do those things then change? So in this case, I think that, as I said, the afterlife affects religion, it affects how individuals behave, and it probably affects some other in respect to death and whether they want to be a good person or not. Oh yeah, and it also affects how they deal with grief and loss, right? Oh, my grandmother is not gone into the ether, she's in heaven, she's in a better place now, or something like that. So then how do those three things change when you add karmic reincarnation? You can obviously then think of other things, but I think that's a good way to start thinking about it. The second thing in regards to it, and I think that then that's also a really useful way to explain it in the debate, right? In the debate, you can just be like, okay, we overall see that there's going to be shifts in this three things because we think that current beliefs in the afterlife affect those three things. So we're just going to explain why it is that those things are much better in a world where karmic reincarnation exists. Okay, then second thing. The other thing that I think is useful and is to pick a metric and explain why is better than the other. Yeah, so in terms of sort of comparatives. So for example, and I'm going to use this as an example later on as well, but this was a motion at Astana Eudc. This house would only allow university admission on the basis of standardized testing as opposed to non-quantitative methods. So I think that a very frequent argument that you probably saw in this debate if you were there, or that you would have seen in this debate if you weren't there, is you would have probably had a discussion about whether quantitative testing is fairer or less fair. And I think that you probably also would have heard about whether it's easier to call out bias in interviews or whether it's easier to call out bias in standardized tests. I think that then you also might have had a discussion about how the admission process itself happens and why, for example, I don't know, interviews are made more accessible because people feel more at ease. It's an opportunity to talk to alumni and stuff like that. I think that then what you can do is to explain why it is that a particular metric in your world is better. So let's say I'm in opening government and I say, yes, it should. So my metric is accessibility. So I can explain why it is that in the comparative, I think that overall, my world is more accessible than the other one. So I'm going to use the last argument. So for example, overall, I think that the problem when you have an essay method or an alumni interview method is twofold. Firstly, is that overall, there's just considerably less time that is devoted to each application if there are many of them. But secondly, it's that overall there is a huge incentive from universities to decrease the number of candidates that they actually send towards reading essays or reading alumni interviews, because precisely there's just not that much time that they can devote to this. So it means that overall they have big incentives to either throw applications out of the window at the smallest mistake or at the smallest issue that they may have with a candidate. But second, it also means that then overall it's an incentive of the university to try and appear unapproachable and to try and appear incredibly difficult to get into, to discourage candidates from applying so that they don't have to deal with as many numbers of admissions. This means it's actually way easier to instead convince individuals to apply to a university that just requires standardized tests for two reasons. Firstly, because it is easier for teachers to push them to get in, because if they identify, oh, you have a really high test score, this is a test score that would get you into X university, it is much easier for them to show the individual that, you know, that is true versus attempting to convince them that an essay was very good. But secondly, it's also because it just feels more available when it is more available, rather than when universities explicitly try and discourage application because they don't want to deal with insane numbers of admissions, as that makes their admission process more difficult and more grueling, and they have to spend more money on it. Overall, the more important thing, and then you pick a metric, right? Overall, the most important thing in this debate is accessibility. And the reason why accessibility is better is, as I explained above, because the main reason that, or one of the main reasons that makes accessibility very difficult, it isn't just that there's an uneven playing field, but also it is that the system convinces you to self-select out of even applying. Overall, there's insane amounts of incredibly smart individuals everywhere that would probably get into university. They just never felt that it was for them. And part of that was, you know, the terrible twisted incentives of those universities. So I think here the important thing is just like you pick a metric and explain why then, given your argument, your comparative is better than the other world. The third thing that I would say is that also the comparative is often just a change in the status quo. So a nice analysis structure that I think is kind of useful is, as John used above, is sort of describe what the problems with the status quo, like identify the status quo and identify problems with it. So in the status quo, there's sort of like two problems with the university admission system. And then this is how our solution changes that problem. So there's sort of two problems. Firstly is that individuals don't feel like they'll ever be able to get in because they just see it as incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging. There's this sort of vague essays that are posted about topics that you don't understand how they relate to you. But second, it's also because universities themselves don't necessarily encourage individuals to apply in the same way that they could if they would just standardize testing, because it's insane amounts of work to probably grade all those essays and get alumni interviews. So even if a lot of people apply, it's very likely that most of those will get a very passing glance at best. So how does our solution fix the problem? And then you kind of explain how you do it. So again, this is, I think, a very comparative way to think about it, because you're directly comparing sort of like problems in one world versus how the other world solves it. And I think that that's also a kind of like fun, useful structure to use. The last thing that I would say, and this is going to sound kind of dumb, but I think that is generally, or at least I found it generally very helpful. Force yourself to use comparative language to deliberately integrated into the argument. So instead of saying this is bad, say this is worse than. Instead of saying it's good, it's like this is better than. And obviously there's like, I don't know, maybe because I'm ESL, but I know fancier words that are not comparative. So like horrifying, more horrifying, just as kind of weird, you know? But I think that forcing yourself to use comparative language is actually quite important. And even though it sounds kind of dumb, it's a very easy way to ensure that you're at least always being like, it is more than. So a big thing that I used to do is I used to write like worse than ... on my notes to remind myself to add the sort of like, it is worse than what opening government tells you, which is blah, 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 blah. Cool. So next thing that we're going to move on to, weighing. In terms of improving your weighing and your analysis, I think that this weighing is like a thing that allegedly, or not, rather, weighing I think is a thing that a lot of English as a second language speakers that are very good learned how to do quite early on, because very frequently, if you have a very distinguishable accent, it's difficult for judges to follow you if you speak super fast, but also overall, it is harder to speak as fast as native speakers in the first place. Which is completely fine, because in debating, you don't need to beat every single argument to win. You just need to prove that the arguments that you're running are the more important ones. So even if the other ones are also true, it doesn't matter because yours are the more important ones. But obviously, I think it's like a skill that is important to have overall. But it is a particularly useful one when dealing with people who are like, I have 17 different arguments that I want to run this speech. Doesn't matter if they have 17 and they prove every single one of them, if you still prove that the one argument that you have is true, and it's also more important than all of those arguments. So I sort of mentioned this already in the sort of structure of arguments, that I think that there's three parts to every argument, right? Firstly, why is it true? Second, why is it important? Third, why is it more important? And I think that the way to integrate it within your argument is to add it at the impact bit. And here is the thing that I think that people oftentimes miss. People are like, oh, impacts are just like a bit where you have to say in 10 seconds that this is gonna lead to a lot of death or something like that. It's just like really quick. You don't have to spend that much time on it because it's not analysis. It's more important that you prove your analysis, and because if you don't, then the impact doesn't happen. And obviously that's true, and you should spend a lot of time on your analysis. But I think that impacts aren't just, oh, I explained how all of that, and now I can therefore claim that this leads to more death or more bad things or more or less education. I think that impacts also have a place in the debate, and that place is for weighing, and you should definitely spend time on this. So I think that the way that you also definitely can start doing this in Prime Minister, which is also a thing that a lot of people don't do, but that you should definitely do. But I'll go into it more in a sec. But yeah, so I think that the thing that you want to do is when you get to your impact, okay, so impact, and then directly compare your argument against other arguments and explain why it's more important. So it's like, moreover, this is more important than what the opposition is going to stand up here in today's debate and tell you. And we think that this is the most important argument because, and an explanation there. You can definitely do this since Prime Minister, and I think it's very useful because then it means that then the leader of opposition has to still stand up and already try to explain why is it that their arguments are even relevant. And in many cases they won't, so they will just argue with your case, but not necessarily argue with your weighing, and then deputy can just like really weaponize that. So for example, yeah, let's go for the second one. This house prefers a world where co-parenting is primarily non-romantic. So I think that then on opening government, let's say you run an argument about why it is that overall it's better when you co-parent with a friend, because very frequently when you co-parent with a romantic partner, you chose them not because of their great parenting skills or because you agree with them in everything regarding children and how they should be raised, but rather because you love them, because you want to therefore form a family with them, because it's kind of weird to have like a husband or a wife or a partner and then also have this like friend that you co-parent with. So overall, you choose a romantic partner. It tends to be the primary reason is that you love them rather than you think that they're great parents or you have a sort of cohesive view of how children should be raised. And instead, when you co-parent with someone who's not your romantic partner, so a friend, you have many friends, and in many cases, or rather in that case, the main way by which you will select your co-parent is exactly if you have similar views on how children ought to be raised, and therefore you will agree on big decisions in a child's life, like where to go for school, what extracurricular activities they should do, what is the way to deal with conflict, etc. And also, you are more likely to do things like, and also you're more likely to also evaluate on some level whether or not you think they would be a good parent. So overall, then I think that then in your weighing, let's say that I'm prime minister on this, you would do, okay, impact. Overall, we think that children are raised better, therefore, because they have parents that are more informed, but also because the main source of conflict in a child's life is oftentimes not just, or rather the main source of conflict within a family is very often disagreements on how the child is raised that leads to like bad things, whatever. We think that this is much more important than what the opposition might argue. Why is it, for example, that I don't know what the opps is in this debate, like, we think this is more important than what the op might argue in regards to why it is important to have a loving and cohesive family unit that gives you a good example for romantic relationships later on in life, because romantic relationships, you can gain examples of how good they are and where it is that you can find them and identify a healthy one in many places, and you will likely be able to get that as well from the partners of both of your parents. So you can get examples from that elsewhere, but the most important, but the conflict that comes out of parents constantly fighting and not having any clear decision about how it is that the child should be raised is something that, you know, you can't remove when you come from parents that are separate and have separate goals. And also the main source of like trauma and sadness in a child's life is very frequently mess ups that the parents did. So it is much better if you remove that entirely. So again, I think that this is sort of like, it's kind of like badly, not greatly done. Not that this isn't the most amazing like argument or the most amazing way, because I just kind of like came up with it now. But I think that the important thing is, again, I am trying to do that weighing, right? I'm doing why is this more important than other things, and I am giving at least some reasons as to why my argument is more important. And again, you can start doing that since PM. It's very unlikely that the op would actually run the argument that I came up with, but there is some weighing there that judges can even start to see like, okay, I can see why this is more important than other arguments that fit under similar standards than what she described. So you can already sort of start to do that. You can try the second one at home. The second one is also the other thing that I want to mention here is also it's important to not just consider impacts as things to be weighed in the debate. You're also weighing mechanisms against each other. And this is a thing that particularly deputies and whip speakers will probably end up doing. Do they have mechanisms? Which mechanism do you think is more likely, or which mechanism do you think happens more, or which mechanism, when it happens, has a much higher impact, and therefore you should put your marbles behind it? These are all ways in which you can compare the different mechanisms that teams provided in the debate. And again, teams very frequently do the sort of like 3 seconds sort of, and our mechanisms were way more likely to happen and therefore we win, or like our mechanisms were just way better, and then move on as like, oh, I feel like I should say this, but I don't actually understand why it's important, so I'm not expanding in it. And I think that you do have to, right? So for example, this House believes that the US should ban the sale of vital components for the manufacturing of electronic devices like semiconductors, which are produced in the United States, or use American technology or software, to Huawei and other major Chinese companies. So a big thing that the prop probably says in this debate is that China does not have the capacity to make these semiconductors, and therefore it is very easy then to use this as a tool in order to get them to behave in better ways. Another thing that maybe they could, yeah, so let's say so that's probably an argument that at some point they run, right? And also about how it is that overall Huawei having semiconductors themselves is kind of bad because China is doing all of this like shady things. So unless they stop doing that shady things, then, you know, better for them to not have semiconductors. I think that then a thing that the prop probably argues is, no, China actually can make semiconductors. And obviously that just becomes a matter of, okay, which one is giving me better reasons or better mechanisms? And I think that that's when like the evaluation of things happens, right? That I think that the prop saying sort of it's really hard to make semiconductors, really hard, is not very persuasive. And I think that even if it is true that like in the real world, it's very hard and China maybe is not able to do it, you can definitely come up with convincing reasons as to why they would be able to, right? It's like they have access to quite a lot of rare minerals because they have invested quite a lot into Belt and Road projects that travel through countries that have access to those rare earth minerals, and China themselves possess them. So they have the capacity to craft semiconductors because they have the materials. Second, they also have enough money to probably get experts that currently make semiconductors to come to China and make those semiconductors themselves. For them. Thirdly, they also have quite a lot of manufacturing industry, given that semiconductors have to be an automated process because it's so delicate. China is actually in a really good position to do that because they're so used to manufacturing en masse. So just saying it's really hard to make semiconductors isn't particularly compelling. We overall think that there's sufficient reason as to why it's likely to happen. So I think, again, this is kind of like a weighing thing, right? I'm explaining or why is it that one side is more likely via using reasons. So yeah, you can still weigh mechanisms against each other and explain which one is more likely, which one happens more, which one has a higher impact, and therefore you should care about more. Cool. So I don't think there's any questions so far. So yeah, the other things, and these ones are kind of smaller because I think that these three are the big ones, sort of like weighing, doing comparatives, and doing mechanisms. But I think that other things that are kind of useful to go through that I'm also going to talk about. The first one of them is framing. I think that overall framing is just adding context about the current world where the motion occurs that either supercharges or reduces the importance of arguments. Here's the big thing that I want you guys to get out of this framing slide. Framing is not a game winner in the debate. You still have to make arguments. So very frequently I've seen, or rather, it used to happen to me, right? That I'd be like, but in closing opposition, we provided the framing. So I don't understand why we're losing or like why we didn't beat opening up. And it's because very frequently your framing is good, right? But your framing is just making opening opposition's arguments better. You still don't have those arguments. And those arguments would still exist and are probably okay, even without your framing. Like unless the argument literally was like proving nothing until your framing arrived, then it isn't really like it is adding something, but then it's not necessarily always adding the winning material because sure, maybe it makes the argument stronger, which is why maybe you beat the other two teams, but very often it doesn't make the argument like that much better or so much better than the original argument without the frame. And that kind of makes sense. But overall, framing itself isn't the game winner. You still have to make arguments. So the most famous sort of framing example probably happened in like a Euros final, actually, that Sheffield, my alma mater, actually won. This house believes that the feminist movement should oppose military interventions with claim to further women's rights. So in closing opposition, the frame was, okay, but can you imagine how it would look like if the feminist movement came out and said, I know that this intervention is meant to help women, but we don't want that. We don't want to help women. So basically, a sort of like optically, it's just gonna look horrible. And that is a frame, but I still think that, and that's I think the most famous part of that debate. But you still have to make arguments, and they still have to make arguments to win, right? You still have to argue why it is that that's going to be the way that the media is going to view it. You still have to argue why then the way that that's viewed is going to be detrimental to the feminist movement. So it isn't just the frame that makes the argument stand. It is arguments themselves, and the frame itself is just supercharging it. I think another maybe clearer example is given the dichotomy, this house believes that animal rights activists should focus on environmental impacts of meat consumption rather than empathy for animals in their campaigns. So a frame that I would probably give if I was opening government in this motion is I would overall argue that you already have the sympathy and the allegiance of people who are vegans and vegetarians. They are never going to start eating meat purely because your movement is not that nice anymore. So they're not going to be like, oh, actually, I don't like the animal rights movement anymore. I'm going to ditch them. And equally, people who genuinely believe in like the correct treatment of animals aren't going to suddenly ditch the movement just because I think that because the animal rights movement changed its advocacy. So then the most important thing is to try and get individuals that aren't currently vegans or vegetarians or oppose the abuse of animal rights for moral reasons, but individuals that don't see anything wrong with that. And the only way to get them to change that, so that is the main group that we are talking about. And then I think that frame sort of gets you out of the other side being like, oh, you betray vegans and vegetarians, and there's going to be a lot of drama with people who currently support you, because you're like, no, these aren't the important group. This is the most important group. How is it then that you get that group's allegiance? And I think then that's the bit where the frame supercharges the argument, but you still have to make the argument, if that makes sense. Like, I still have to argue why it is that I get more support from people who aren't vegans or vegetarians or love animals and think that abusing them is morally objectionable. Why is it that I get more support from them when I focus on environmental impacts rather than empathy for animals? I still have to explain that. So basically, don't be fooled by framing. You still have to make arguments, but framing is just kind of a description or a clever way to look at the motion by sort of looking at the world that sort of makes the argument better or worse. Other things that I want to quickly talk about, nuance. In terms of nuance, there's sort of just two things that I want to mention. Firstly, draw a spectrum in terms of the impacts that happen and engage with the spectrum from the other side. This means that overall you get better analysis because you're explaining what happens across multiple cases. This is good because very often the other side will be like, I will only respond to the most extreme of the scenarios. They'll do the bad thing. And then you'll be like, okay, judge, they didn't respond to our nuanced analysis. And you win. The second thing is, I think that also it's important because it forces you to think of what happens in different situations, because very frequently it is different. You're just not forcing yourself to think through it and explain why it is. So for example, this house believes that the primary responsibility for caring for the elderly should lie with the family rather than the state. On Gov, there's probably some arguments about why it is that, you know, state homes are terrible and quite horrible and like terrible conditions for the elderly, and they get abused by nurses and stuff like that, and by doctors and stuff like that. But that's probably the like most extreme scenarios. So you also want to engage with the sort of, but even in situations in which they're not perfectly nice, okay, care home, why is it that it's still better with the family? And in that situation, it isn't always about, it can be about physical care, but there's also probably other things about like emotional needs and stuff, or like feeling connected to the last surviving members of people you care about in this world, because all of your friends are slowly dying. I don't know. But basically, think of different situations, because then you aren't just arguing like the benefit is there's less abuse from doctors and nurses. You're also arguing, but in the vast majority of situations, there's also more personalized care that makes the person feel more like a human being. Also, there's more emotional fulfillment for this individual, which leads to happier outcomes. But basically, force yourself to think about different situations. The second thing in nuance is also force yourself to think of how it happens or how it applies to different groups. So in the example there, not necessarily different groups, right? Because we're still talking about women, but actually encouraging women to not have children probably plays very differently if you're a woman who does want children, if you're a woman who doesn't want children, or if you're a woman who already has children. So those are all three different groups that you can sort of think about during prep time. That's sort of like, does it change? And then make arguments about. So nuance is just basically engage with the fact that not all groups are homogeneous, and also engage with the fact that there is a spectrum in the way in which things occur. So it doesn't just go terrible. It goes like, slightly bad, oh, was terrible. And therefore, in your analysis, addressing those or forcing yourself to address those is important. So I would say when you're impacting or explaining like a harm that happens with something, you want to always do the sort of worst case if you want to, but you also want to do that, but in the vast majority of cases, middle ground. Also, this is important in terms of response. Always response to the nuanced characterization. You also don't want to go like, like on the up on this debate, you don't want to go, oh, and on their side, they're forcing people to stay with their abusive mother, even if she was terrible to them. And like, sure, that's some people, and in some cases, it is not the vast majority of cases. So that's not really also engaging with the nuance of it. Cool. One of the last things that, I think this is the last thing that I want to discuss before, penultimate thing, is context and examples. And just really quickly, overall, vagueness is terrible. If I can't land your impacts or picture your mechanisms, it means I don't know why I should care about this, or I don't know where it happens. So be clear and contextualize the debate and explain your examples. The main thing that I want people to get from this is it doesn't have to be a real example. It just has to sound real. By that, I don't mean make up things. Making up things is terrible if you get caught. By that, I mean a lot of debates don't really ask you for like a specific example of that time when a child knew something and then his mother hit him or whatever. It just has to sound real, basically. So for example, that motion about prioritizing one child, like as a middle-class family or as a family, a lower middle class, a lower income family, you prioritize one child in terms of resources instead of giving equal distribution to all of your family. Like, I think that a sort of a description of like one thing that you could argue in the opposition is, you know, parents are actually quite bad at identifying when it is that one child is particularly promising. They very frequently be like, ooh, that child reminds me of myself, or ooh, I like this child because this child is a man, or oh, I like this child because they are really into sport and I always wanted to be a sportswoman and I am projecting my dreams into them, even if the child's not particularly good at it. So like basically parents are actually quite bad at, you know, identifying those things. And those are all things that you can like describe as phenomena in society without having to specifically give an example. Like, for example, the second one, it is like very frequently parents are sort of taught by society that men are just smarter, more competent, and better than women. So they deliberately put male children in positions in which they can succeed more, and therefore they convince themselves that they are actually the smarter child. The child is smarter, but that's because his sister doesn't really go to school or isn't incentivized and encouraged to do her homework. And that prioritization is bad. But basically, like, that is kind of an example. I am just not using like a real example, but I am using the context of the real world as my example. And I think that that's useful. In the motion about the feminist movement in religious societies that I described earlier, one of the things that I did when I was arguing, because I just came up with it and I didn't really have any notes, was that I wasn't very descriptive in terms of what is the kind of change that I am attempting to get here, right? And sure, there's like some things that you can be specific about, but it is important to just be like, what is it that you envision these institutions are going to be able to add? Like, what is the new change and new social policies that the feminist movement is going to be able to pass? Because I think that the UP can very clearly stand up and be like, here's a bunch of things that are just completely off the table now, basically. You absolutely cannot have divorce. You absolutely can't have things like abortion. You probably can have family planning. You also can have support for LGBT plus women. So all of that is off the table. So what exactly are you wanting to pass? So specificity and context is key. It doesn't necessarily all have to be examples from IR. It's rather context from the real world. Also, because I had this question recently, and when someone was like, oh, like, so both of us said a fact, and I am convinced that my fact is right, but the other side sort of added some reasons as to why it might not be a fact, basically. So is it not enough for me to say this fact? And ideally, it would be, right? But obviously, debate is a game not just of who has the absolute truth, but also who can best prove that truth. I think Hamza does it very well, where he's just like, he gets POI'd an example, and he's like, I'm just going to counter assert that is not true. So now we're equal. And I'm going to give you one reason as to why I'm right. So that means I'm winning. So even if he knows that what he's saying is wrong, or what he's saying maybe holds less weight in like an IR magazine or whatever, he can still win it that way, right? And I think that that's sort of the important thing to remember, is that whenever you do give an example, like 100% this happened in America, so you can't really argue against it. you also want to give reasons as to why that is true. You also want to do that. You always want to do that too. Obviously, don't make it ridiculous. After the events of recently, you can obviously just be like, look, white supremacists did storm the US Capitol. And if the other side is like, what? That never happened, then that's also obviously absolutely untrue. There's like a medium amount of truth that we do require. So also, for example, someone being like, the CIA actually doesn't have very advanced weaponry is not very convincing, and you probably don't need excessive amounts of, like, you don't need any analysis really to just be like, no, they actually do have quite a lot of advanced weaponry. But yeah, so don't make it ridiculous, but it is important to always give reasons as to why your example is true. The last thing, and I think this is maybe the more important thing, is pushing a narrative. And I think that I have said this across multiple different workshops, but that's just because I do think that it is sort of quite important. By pushing a narrative, and this is the thing that I think really separates sort of really, really good, strong teams versus teams that are kind of, okay, they break, they win some debates, etc. Is that when that sort of like, that really, really, really good teams just have a very clear direction of what their case is, why is it important, and why does it win them the debate. And that's what I mean by pushing a narrative. I think that there's a bunch of things that you can do to make it clearer, but overall it is sort of that main narrative that I think means that when you go into the deliberation room, the panel is always like, this team won, and I have very, very clear reasons as to why. Rather than being like, oh, you know, they made some good arguments. I'm not like super sure why they win. I'll have to like go through my notes a bit. So I think there's sort of 4 more things that you can do with this. Firstly is always try to summarize your case in a sentence, and why is it important, and why do you win? I think that having that sentence somewhere in your speech, then it's important. I think useful places to put that is, as my second thing, introductions and conclusions. People think that introductions are not useful and they're just a waste of space. That's because people don't use introductions correctly. Introductions are supposed to highlight your narrative. Why is your case winning? What is the main takeaway that you want the judge to have from your speech? Equally, conclusions. You also want to have very clear, and this is more for like second, right? You want to have clear strategic goals when you go in terms of what it is that you're wanting to do. So basically, again, a summary in a sentence of why you're winning, but you want to have those goals going in. And I think that the last thing is also for like second or whip, you also want to have clear takeaways of what you are taking from each argument or what you're taking from each clash. So this is why, for example, having a clash structure in whip, I think is very useful, is because it's very clean in the things that you need to take away from each clash. What you need to take away from this is it's terrible for whatever reason, and therefore we win the debate. What you need to take away from this. And then it's like a really nicely wrapped thing that then the judge can be like, oh yeah, like, I mean, they proved those 3 things. So that's why, like, I think they overall win the debate. Obviously, there can also be strategic takeaways when you do like team by team, in that you can just be like, look, the main thing that you need to remember is that opening opposition lost when they failed to prove this argument. And we have shown you the complete opposite, which means that we win. So again, very clear takeaways from each of the comparisons. But the important thing is that you have to sort of kind of spoon feed the judge what your narrative is, because it's often way less clear than you think it is. Cool. So that's it in terms of sort of important things that I think happen about analysis. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is sort of prep, or rather coming up with constructive, because you know how to analyze it, but then, oh, how do I come up with it? And here's the thing, right? I think that people are very frequently way better at coming up with arguments than at fleshing them out. When you do a prompt, the vast majority of times your will have ideas, and they will be like around the correct grounds. Like all of the like that I have spoken with in the last 6 months, they always have the right idea. It's just that sometimes they aren't super confident in it, or they don't flesh it out enough, but they always have the right idea. So again, everyone has ideas. It's just a matter of developing techniques to sort of flesh them out. But if you're like, okay, no, I actually am really terrible at coming up with constructive, how do I do it? We're going to talk about it in a bit. The first thing to note, I think, is OG is actually a really great position, and people just hate it because they're cowards. But it is the best way to guarantee yourself a second, because you say the first, most obvious arguments before everyone else. and they are very frequently the best arguments. There's a reason why they're the most obvious ones. So it is a really good way to guarantee a second, because you can just say your very nice, obvious arguments and say them very well, so that even if closing has an extension, it's just not as good as your very good, well-analyzed, obvious arguments, and you can just smash opening up. In which case, even if closing up pulls it out of the back, you still have a second. So that's good for you. So the really important thing in OG really is twofold. To firstly identify what the debate is about and set up the correct arguments for it, and also to analyze them well, so that when you so that then you beat extension and win top half. So we already sort of talked about how to analyze them well and how to improve your analysis to make sure that that happens. So we're going to now talk about sort of how to construct those arguments in the first place. The main thing that I want to emphasize is don't freak out. Be confident in your own ideas. Again, speaking with some people in recent months, but the vast majority of the time, they have the correct idea. They're just kind of like, oh, I don't know, this is right, like whatever. Your partner is your partner. They won't make fun of you. You have 15 minutes. If they do, that's a waste of time, and they're a mean partner, so you should switch. But also, and here's the more important one and more applicable one, is that frequently people freak out because they're like, oh my God, I don't know anything about this motion. Like, I don't know what's going on. I haven't been reading the news, so what do I do? Like, I don't know anything about the NFL. CA teams usually do test the, could I debate this from first principles? So it is doable, even if maybe not necessarily winnable. Maybe a team that will know more will be at an advantage, but you should still be able to give completely fine arguments. So for example, in Dogsbridge, we set a motion about the NFL, and a lot of people freaked out because they're like, oh, I don't know that much about the NFL. But I think that if you look at the overall motion, even if you have like literally no idea what the NFL is, you can still be like, okay, so this is a debate about whether it is better to encourage people via punishments or via rewards. And then I can just explain why one works better than the other. So basically, debate from first principle. Sure, maybe a team that does know a lot about the NFL might be better able to explain those things, and they will therefore win, but that doesn't mean that you're not able to make those arguments in the first place. So always, when you see a motion that you don't really feel super confident in, try and remember to argue it from first principles. Cool. So how do you come up with arguments? 4 ways. Firstly, what do I have to prove to win? Try and think, what is it that as a judge would convince you to vote for this team? Like, what are the main things? Second, what are the big issues that are likely to be discussed? So that is sort of what are the things that teams are going to argue with each other about? And lastly, what is the other side going to say? So I think that those are all things that you can consider during prep time, because some people find sort of coming up with burdens to sort of like, what is it that I need to prove in order to win this debate, to win easy? Other people find it easier to think about it in clashes. Like, what do we think that teams are very likely to argue about? Like, what are things that I will say and they will say, and we will clash on that, because that's also an important issue in the debate. So probably also good to have an argument about it. Some people are also better at somehow, like, I don't know, I somehow find it easier to think about what the other side will say when I get my side, even though I'm supposed to be prepping my side. So thinking about what the other side is going to say and then just literally flipping it is another useful way to come up with arguments. The last one, and this is more for motions that are kind of weird. What are the most debates have a reason for existing, right? And most debates are there because the CA team saw something and was like, oh, this is like interesting. Can we make a motion out of this? So what like interesting phenomena is the motion trying to evaluate? Where can you observe it? And can you make a judgment out of that? So we're gonna go through some examples, but the classics are like, this house would ban zoos. What do I have to prove to win? I think that in terms of burdens, this is pretty clear in that you can't have to prove firstly that they are places in which animals get really, really horribly mistreated, and therefore you should ban them. So they're bad, basically, so ban. Or secondly, that it is immoral to keep animals in cages, and therefore that's another reason why you should ban them. So either of those will win you the debate. So it's like burdens. What are big issues that are likely to be discussed? It's like a different angle. So for that one, you probably are going to discuss animal rights and where the animals are better off. But you're also likely to kind of discuss like the educational and entertainment value of zoos. So in terms of the educational value, you can probably argue things on both sides. In terms of entertainment, on one side, you can probably argue like the morality of using animals as entertainment. And on the other, it's like zoos are fun. But those are, again, big issues that are likely to be discussed. But if you notice it, these are like 2 different ways to sort of get to kind of similar things. the last thing is also like, what is the other side going to say? Because I can also think that the opposition will probably tell me about why it is that zoos actually are quite useful and valuable in terms of teaching children to be close to nature and to care about it when they're so incredibly separated from it. So I think that there's an argument that you can make about education as well, that you sort of have to flip in terms of why they're bad. So I think that's another way to sort of come up with it. Obviously, this is a very sort of simple motion, but what happens when the motion is kind of like hard and you don't get it? So again, another Doxbridge motion that, so sort of I acknowledge it is like kind of difficult to get from OG, I think. So cosmopolitanism is an ideology that focuses on an individual's identity being connected to the global community. This house regrets the rise of cosmopolitan culture. So to start with this one, what is the sort of interesting phenomena that the motion is trying to evaluate? So it is trying to evaluate like the rise of cosmopolitan culture, right? The sort of the belief that, or rather that in modern days, people feel more connected to the global community or think that they're more connected to global community rather than usual links like to nation or to their local areas. Where do I observe this phenomenon? So like the motion is essentially asking me to cast an evaluation as to whether that's good or bad. So then it's comparing that versus the alternative, which is probably like more connection to your nation or local identity. So, okay, this is what the debate is about, right? So this is something that I think is helpful towards identifying what the motion is getting to. But I think that the second part is also important to ask yourself, where do I observe this phenomenon? Because I don't necessarily observe a rise necessarily in this cosmopolitan culture in individuals who voted Brexit, because they seem to be very happy with, you know, being English or whatever. But I do observe it in, for example, London overall, that voted to remain in the EU, but less so in other areas in Britain, which voted to leave. So I think that you can then probably also derive arguments from this in that, you know, the rise of cosmopolitan culture hasn't happened homogeneously, but rather it has happened more in certain groups than in others, which has led to resentment, rise of populism, etc. So basically, I think that asking yourself sort of like, what question is the motion posing? Why does this motion exist? And then also trying to ask yourself whether you observe this motion happening can oftentimes also lead to then being better able to come up with these three things. So that's, I think, how you can come up with arguments. So these are just kind of like examples, but again, sort of like the university ones, you pick sort of like, what do I have to prove to win? I want to prove that it will give everyone a fair shot at university and allow for greater diversity in admissions. Those are the two things that I want to prove. And then you derive arguments from that, like standardized testing is a better equalizer, any non-quantitative method as subjectivity, biases are harder to hide and easy to correct, less people self-select out of applying, and all of that goes towards proving my burden. The Astana motion, this was an Astana motion as well. This house opposes the commercialization of mindfulness. So again, this is, I think, one of those debates that is a bit difficult to sort of get because it's asking you to evaluate a weird concept, right? So I think that then you again go sort of like, okay, what is this motion? Like, what is interesting that this motion is asking me to evaluate? Okay, so it's the fact that mindfulness is getting more commercialized, that there's like more apps on the market about it, probably because it's getting commercialized, that people are trying to sell it to you. So basically, this debate just evaluates whether commercialization of a thing is bad or good. So then I can just make first principle arguments about why commercializing a thing is bad. So then I think that you can make arguments about how it commercialization is bad because it ruins it, because it takes the essence of mindfulness away, because it's supposed to be about noticing things, but capitalism and being happy with where you are, but capitalism is all about, you know, making you unhappy with where you are so that you continue to buy things. And also the fact that you have an app means that the app is focusing you on the app rather than on like noticing and being happy with things around you. So it ruins mindfulness. But secondly, it's also probably worse for your mental health because part of commercializing it is also making sure that individuals want it and see it as a viable alternative to things like therapy. So it means that workplaces probably offer you mindfulness instead of, you know, actual mental health support or other things. So I think that, again, you can make arguments based on first principles as to why, like, the nature of commercialization means that there's like bad outcomes for mindfulness, but bad outcomes for mental health as well. And this is, again, just from asking yourself sort of like, what interesting phenomena is this trying to make me evaluate? Where can I see it? And I'm like, I don't know, app stores, My college also keeps sending me emails about signing up to mindfulness courses. So I also observe it there. Do they do that instead of, you know, more mental health support for other things? Maybe, I don't know, but I can definitely argue that they would, etc. So yeah, so I think that those are sort of ways that you can start to consider in prep time in terms of coming up with arguments. Obviously, other things that we have already kind of discussed are things like, does it affect different groups differently? How does the situation play out in very extreme scenarios versus less extreme scenarios? So those are also, I think, useful ways to coming up with ideas. What the comparative is. But yeah. The last thing quickly is in note-taking. And I'm not going to go into it that much because I don't think that I am the authority on it, but I'm just going to give you some sort of tips that I think are useful. The first of them is that I do use different colors in my notes. I always use two when I'm giving a prime minister speech. I always have a different, like, I always use like, let's say, blue for the title of my argument and the point of my argument, and for the impact and the weighing. So it's like a sandwich, sort of. So I know when I'm at the start and I can like highlight it quickly, and I know when I'm at the end, and then I need to spend time doing my why is this more important than other arguments in the debate. But ideally, if I'm giving extension, I sometimes, because I have more time to write it, I sometimes have more, because I also have different ones for claims and reasons. I also usually use two colors for what they say and what my response is, because I think that then I spend less time trying to figure out what is what. Basically, I think that a big reason why people babble is because they're trying to find out where they're going next, because their notes are not super clear. So having visual cues like colors, I think, is very helpful to that. The other tip that I would say is sort of like try and balance it. And this sounds kind of difficult, but I do think that, again, a big problem with people babbling isn't because they like don't have structure or whatever. It's rather because they don't understand their notes, so they don't know where they're going next, so they're making time. And this can be something that you deliberately do or something that you kind of subconsciously do. So I think that then there needs to be a balance. You have to have enough written down so that you know where you're going next, but also not too much that it confuses you and it's difficult to read. For that, I think that using bullet points rather than long paragraphs is the easiest thing. My last sort of two things that I think are helpful is, firstly, to try and have time limits written for each argument. So at the top of each argument, I would normally write the sort of like a big 5, for example, and a circle on my second argument to just be like, at 5 minutes, I have to move to this argument. I absolutely have to. So even if I don't achieve my goal of being at that argument at 5 minutes, when 5 minutes hits, I do know that I have to like wrap up whatever it is that I'm doing elsewhere in my speech and move on to that. So I think that's also helpful because time allocation is hard, y'all. But the last thing is also that irrespective of how you take notes, because obviously people take notes in different ways. They maybe do like columns, they maybe do like a little square, they maybe do like just like notes like in a notebook. Irrespective of how you take notes, I think that you also need to have a space somewhere in your sheet where you just write down random stuff that you hear in your speech that you want to smash. So it's either sort of like they said this really weird thing and I think that it's like mega contradictory, or really like a horrible thing to say, so I'm just gonna be like, oh, I'm holding you up to account. Or secondly, you can also be like, okay, here are like the 3 mechanisms that they gave that I absolutely had to respond to. So obviously, while the ultimate goal is to have like a super clean flow, very beautiful, blah, 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 no one has time for that realistically. And most top speakers don't actually have very beautiful flows. Most of them just kind of like write down random things that they hear across the speech that they know are important and they have to respond to. Obviously, it's better if you actually flow, but you can leave that to your partner who isn't speaking. But I think that the main thing is just have a space where you actually write down the main like things that you need to respond to in sort of quick words, so that you can actually deal with those. But yeah, obviously this is like non-exhaustive, and this isn't just a how do you take notes for constructive, because I think that that's very personal and it varies a lot, but these are just maybe like some tips that people might find useful. Cool. So that's it for me. So if people have any questions, we have like 5 minutes before the next workshop starts. So feel free to shoot them. And also on the Discord, there is a Q&A thing where you can also post your questions, and I'll do my best to go through them through the day and trying to address them. So we have a question. In case of having very little amount of time to write a case, how should we distribute time? Is it effective to just write down burdens of proof of all arguments? I don't actually think that that is that effective. I think burdens of proof are just basically effective to help you come up with arguments. But if you look at, for example, like WSDC children versus BP speakers, the vast majority of BP speakers don't actually spend that much time talking about burdens. And that's because, again, like I don't actually think that it is that massively helpful to spend every argument being like, here are the things that I have to prove to win. I think rather it's like an unspoken thing that you can just kind of have in the background, and just in the impact of your argument, you explain why it's more important than other arguments and why it wins you the debate. But basically, don't spend that much time sort of thinking about like burdens of proof. If you spend like 2 minutes on that and trying to like craft them nicely, then that's a waste of time. Rather, instead, just spend like 2 minutes being like, okay, what do we need to prove to win? And therefore, what arguments can we make for that? So I think that in that regard, it's like something that you have to think about during your own individual prep time. Any advice how to contextualize or characterize a debate better? I think that it's sort of what I was saying earlier. I think it's sort of like what I was saying earlier, the sort of, you have to try and think about where that debate applies in the real world. And I think that then that is how you sort of derive your contextualization, to try and think about how the debate plays out in the real world, and then whether it plays out in different ways depending on where. In terms of contextualizing or characterizing, I would say try and think about it in prep time as broadly as you can, and then from there derive your arguments and make sure that you then think about it more in specific. So basically think of it of how it happens in the real world, and then how it happens across different contexts. Wait, let me just text Milos.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Awesome. Yay. Yeah, I'll give you the floor in a sec. How do you ensure that your case is pragmatic enough using empirical data information as a basis? Is it a burden of proof, and is it a must to always prove feasibility? I think that, again, as I said, BP isn't necessarily always a game of truth. It is very often a game of who can prove that they have the truth on their side. So although having information is very handy, certainly, I think that the important thing is to have that sort of, look, here is proof that I'm right, like whatever happened in Georgia recently, but here is also reasons as to why I'm right. So for example, in a debate about, I don't know, whether it's easier to go through the establishment than to try to create radical change in other ways. Maybe your example of going through the establishment is like Stacey Abrams in Georgia actually managing to get quite a lot of voters registered and managing to get the Democrats elected. And that's completely fine. But you also want to give reasons as to why that's true, that you can actually get change through the establishment rather than using that single thing as information. So I think that it's useful in terms of helping you come up with arguments, because then you know a real life situation where it happened and you can come up with reasons with why. But second, also to, like have examples and situations in which it happened in the real world. So it does give you better speaks, but I just think that you also need to have the reasons. I don't think you always need to prove feasibility in BP, because in BP we just kind of assume that opening government can do the thing that they're doing. Sometimes you just need to prove like, will it happen in the way that I want it to, but I don't think it's a more important thing. The last question, and then we're going to give the floor to Milos, but as I said, there's a Q&A in the Discord that you can join. During prep time, I often go into tunnel vision, where I'm thinking of debatory reasons, missing the real world framing and contextualizations. How do you make sure you catch that? To be honest, I think that's kind of a hard one. I think that it's just something that you have to be very aware that you do, and then you just try and think about like, will the average person on the street find this convincing? No. Okay, maybe I should go about this a different way. And obviously there's like some things that we argue differently in debate land than we do in the real world, but I do think that overall you have to be like, do people actually care about this, or have I just been on Debating Serious posting too much? But yeah, I think it's just something that you have to be aware of, because that's obviously like a particular issue that you have rather than something that, you know, happens to everyone. But I think just like write it at the top of your sheet, just be like, think like an average person, to always remind yourself of that. I think just writing things on top of your prep time sheet is helpful. But yeah, cool. So that
Can I add
is
something to that, Lucía?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and because I have something that I've always been telling people when they ask me for personal feedback for that, which is I think just for 2-3 minutes of the beginning of your prep, you need to try and forget that you are opening government, closing opposition, whatever you are. And that's a hard mindset to do, because your mind goes into, I'm opening government, I now need to prep this case to root for this side of the things. And it's very good to take a bit of a step back and try and think in general terms, more in terms of definitional, contextual thing, which means that you want to, how do you say, clarify each and every word and explain it in simple terms. What is the complexity of this? How does, I don't know, how does police work in terms of the structure? How does a feminist movement work in some of these things? And like discuss this with your partner, not from a perspective, we are opening government, this needs to go in our favor, but what is generally, how do these things work? Which brings you a lot of, how do you say, these complexities in context, and it helped me actually in prep, and I think it helped some other people as well. So sorry that I swooped in, but
no, totally fine. All right, and with that over, I'm gonna give the floor to Milos so he can start his workshop on rebuttal. So yeah, enjoy everyone.